After 3 years of marriage, my wife finally made my identity public and organized a spectacular fireworks show to celebrate my birthday. However, I handed her a divorce agreement and enrolled in a polar research team. All of this because, in my past life, 1 year after she made my identity public, she developed cancer. So that she could focus on her treatment, I underwent a vasectomy and used all my fortune to send her abroad for treatment. Finally, after donating a kidney, I dragged my weakened body to manage the company in her place. But later, by accident, I discovered that she had sent 1,000 posts from her secondary Twitter account. In each photo, she appeared with another man, from the honeymoon, to the pregnancy, and then the birth of her child, a whole life of happiness. It was then that I realized that for all those years, she had been pretending to be sick. The treatment abroad was just an excuse to hide her infidelities. Even the kidney I donated to her, she had given to her lover, and I, sick and without money to buy pain medication, ended up dying alone on the streets. In this new life, I chose to be true to myself and face the world on my own. Chapter 1. Upon hearing that I had changed my mind, the professor seemed somewhat confused. Didn't you say a few days ago that you couldn't leave your wife? How is it that you've changed your mind now? The professor had always supported me, and it wasn't the first time he had invited me to join his research institute to go with him to Africa. But for Grace, I had always rejected his offer. I gave everything for her, but all I received was that tragic ending. Thinking about all of this, my voice became firm. I hadn't thought it through before, but now I've made my decision, and I won't change it. The professor, seeing that I was determined, didn't press further. After hanging up, Grace still hadn't returned home, but her image appeared on Jeremy's social media. In the photo, Grace was walking with her arm around his, her face almost pressed against his, showing a smile full of affection. The suggestive photo was accompanied by a brief caption. Planned for a long time, what I desired has finally come true. I took a deep breath and silently clicked like. After marrying Grace, my friends envied me for having found such a perfect wife, with money and beauty, all in one. But what they didn't know was that my marriage had been a huge lie. She never saw me as a husband, nor did she ever love me. In my past life, Grace acted like a loving wife in front of everyone, but behind the scenes, she was having a secret affair with Jeremy. Only 4 years after we married, she began to fake illnesses. She refused to let me touch her and used her illness as an excuse not to have children. Her acting skills were so incredible that I completely fell for her lie. I worked tirelessly to pay for her treatments, giving everything for her. I never imagined that, when I grew old, I would discover that she had always been deceiving me. Remembering the pain in my chest before I died in my past life, I almost ran out of breath. Luckily, in this life, my body is still healthy, and I don't have any serious diseases from all the social commitments. At that moment, the sound of the phone pulled me from my thoughts. It was Grace. Did you see the tweet? Don't worry, that was just a punishment for losing the game. I replied coldly, I know. If there's nothing else, I'll hang up. It seemed like I wasn't giving her the response she was expecting. As Grace became a bit upset, I already explained. What more do you want, Gabriel? Don't be so capricious. Her voice was full of disdain, while I, inside, remained calm, without any emotion. In my past life, I probably would have rushed to explain myself for her criticisms, but now, not a single extra word interested me to say. Just then, I could hear several male voices rushing in the background of the call. Grace, with a cold tone, spoke again. As punishment for your attitude, I won't come back tonight. Sleep alone. She quickly hung up. I held the phone, and a faint cold smile appeared on my face, as a sense of relief flooded my chest. Grace, if you don't love me, then I won't love you either. I thought this as I looked at the birthday candles that were already going out, slowly closing my eyes. In this life, I will leave Grace behind and live for myself. Chapter 2. The next morning, I woke up with the sun already high in the sky. After finishing my morning routine and having a simple breakfast, I was about to start packing my things when I heard the sound of the door opening outside. Grace walked in, helping a clearly hungover Jeremy. She scanned the living room, and a strong look of anger appeared on her delicate, beautiful face. Why is the house still as messy as it was when I left yesterday? Aren't you supposed to clean up before I get back? I didn't reply, just giving her a cold glance. She helped Jeremy to the sofa, turned around, and said coldly, I won't argue with you today. Jeremy drank too much at the reception last night. I'm bringing him back to freshen up. Can you make him some hangover soup? Don't put ginger in it. He doesn't like it. I slowly lifted my gaze and spoke in a low voice. If he wants it, let him make it himself. I'm not your maid. Grace paused, seemingly not processing it at first. Once she came to, her eyes narrowed, her expression turning a bit angry. Gabriel, what do you mean by that? You know he's completely out of it. Why would you say something like that? Without lifting my head, I casually replied, my hand is injured. I can't cook. At those words, Grace's eyes finally noticed the bandages on my hand, and her face turned awkward. I forgot you got hurt a few days ago saving me. Well, you should rest today then. No more excuses. I didn't say anything further, too lazy to argue with her. I grabbed my clothes and headed to the bathroom. When I finished my shower and came out, I saw that Jeremy had woken up, and Grace was sitting on his lap feeding him fruit. When she saw me, a hint of discomfort flashed across her face, while Jeremy gave me a cold, disdainful look. When our eyes met, the hostility in his gaze was unmistakable. I didn't want to engage with either of them. I turned to go back to the bedroom but heard Grace's cold voice. The leftover breakfast on the table is for you. Don't say I didn't think of you. I lowered my gaze, glancing briefly at the cold leftovers on the table, and a chill ran through me. After all these years of marriage, Grace had never once cooked a meal for me. I always thought she couldn't cook, so I voluntarily took care of all the meals and housework. Now it seemed that wasn't the case. She just never cared enough to do anything for me. Even though I put thought into every birthday gift for her, I never got any thanks. But when Jeremy gave her even a $5 rose, she'd be thrilled for days. Love or indifference, this was the difference. No thanks, I've already eaten, I replied flatly. Grace didn't press it, though she looked a little puzzled. Where did the leftover cake in the fridge come from? Was someone's birthday yesterday? I let out a faint laugh, feeling the irony deeply. Grace remembered everything about Jeremy, but forgot my birthday. Although it stung, I kept my tone neutral as I replied, I just bought it to eat. Her lips twitched, as if she wanted to ask something further, but Jeremy interrupted in a feigned surprised tone. Gabriel, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't yesterday your birthday? At those words, Grace's face immediately drained of color. Her pupils constricted slightly, and she stammered, Gabriel, Before she could finish, Jeremy stood up with exaggerated sympathy, saying, I'm really sorry. Grace was with me last night and couldn't celebrate your birthday. Please don't blame her. As he spoke, he pressed his hand to his chest, pretending to cough. If you're angry, you can hit me or yell at me. Anything. His voice cracked, but the provocation in his eyes was impossible to hide. I pretended not to care, smiling faintly, and stood up to throw the cake from the fridge into the trash. It's fine. Whether I celebrate my birthday or not doesn't matter to her. She only cares about you. As soon as I said that, Grace jumped up angrily. Gabriel, what are you talking about? He's been my friend since childhood. I've known him much longer than you have. If there was anything, we would have been together a long time ago. She seemed to remember something then, and scoffed. So what if you didn't get a birthday celebration yesterday? Do you really need to be so petty and take it out on others? Gabriel, I want you to apologize to Jeremy right now. I listened to her, standing on her moral high ground, and felt a deep sense of emptiness inside. Seeing that I remained silent, Grace's expression faltered, and her tone turned sharper. What's your attitude? I'm talking to you. With that, she grabbed me, her fingers pressing hard on the wound on my hand, her face turning pale with anger. Jeremy suddenly choked up, his voice wavering. Forget it. Don't fight because of me. It was my fault. Gabriel's upset. I'll leave now. With that, he turned away, eyes red, and hurried out of the room. As I watched Jeremy's retreating figure, Grace's face was full of concern. She pushed me aside and hurried after him. Before she left, she threw a final, venomous glare in my direction. I was blind to have married you. Chapter 3. Not wanting to get further tangled with her, I called a friend to draft the divorce agreement, then began packing my things. Looking at the somewhat empty suitcase, I felt a mix of emotions. I didn't have many personal items. Most of the things were Grace's, along with a few couples items we had. These couples items were all my idea, bought on my own. But Grace had never shown any interest. She would always sneer at them. We're adults. Why are we still so childish? Yet, on her private Twitter, there were countless photos of her and Jeremy wearing matching outfits. Looking back now, those photos felt like a mockery of my past ignorance and self-deception. Now, it didn't matter anymore. Tomorrow I would be gone, and nothing meant anything to me. I tried to stop reminiscing, but the sound of footsteps outside the door interrupted me. Grace had finally returned. The moment she saw me, she immediately began to question me. Why? In the past, when she was angry and left the house, I would immediately apologize. But this time, I hadn't even sent a single caring message. She wasn't used to it. Wasn't this always how it's been? Hearing my words, Grace's anger only grew. Stop being so sarcastic. I only scolded you a little. Is that really something to hold a grudge over? When will you learn to be more magnanimous? I quietly watched her speak, my face betraying no emotion. Back in our third year of university, Grace and I had joined the same club. We spent so much time together, and gradually got to know each other more. Her intentions were clear, but I knew then that we came from different worlds and nothing would come of it. Yet, she didn't give up and did everything she could to be kind to me. Slowly, I began to develop feelings for her, and found myself falling in love. We ended up together, almost naturally. I had never wanted to give up on the years we spent together, which is why I had fallen so deep. But now, seeing everything for what it really was, I coldly spoke. We should get a divorce. As soon as she heard my words, Grace looked at me and suddenly scoffed. Gabriel, when did you become the type to play hard to get? Don't think you can pull any tricks. If you have the time to play games, why don't you apologize to Jeremy? Maybe then I'll forgive you. I stared at her calmly, no emotion in my eyes, and spoke with quiet resolve. Grace, I really want a divorce. Upon hearing that, Grace laughed dismissively. When you wanted to marry me, you tried everything you could, endured ridicule from my parents, and finally married me. Now you want a divorce, are you sure about that? Don't even say you don't believe it, my parents wouldn't believe it either. In my past life, my father-in-law and mother-in-law had looked down on me from the very beginning. When they found out I was an orphan without any significant family fortune, they strongly opposed the marriage. I clearly remembered the first time I asked for their approval to marry Grace. My mother-in-law's face turned sour. I didn't want to approve of your marriage, but Grace insisted on marrying you, so we couldn't stop it. But I have to make something clear first. After marriage, all of Grace's assets are considered premarital property. Even if you divorce in the future, you won't get a single cent. So, if you're thinking of marrying her for the money, you better give up on that idea. With that, she took out a prenuptial agreement. The agreement clearly stated that if I ever needed to use any property in Grace's name, I would have to go through a payment system, allowing her to deny the request at any time. And if we divorced, I would leave with nothing. At the time, I had been in it for love, so I didn't take her words to heart. But later, I realized that the love I was pursuing was nothing but a joke. Looking at her face, filled with smugness, I spoke coldly. Believe it or not, I've already made up my mind. As soon as I finished speaking, a loud slap rang out. Grace, furious and embarrassed, slapped me across the face, her eyes filled with venom. A sharp pain spread across my face, but I endured it, keeping my expression cold. Before I could say anything, her phone rang. It was Jeremy again. Grace, where are you? My stomach hurts. There are no painkillers at home. I watched her eyes soften immediately. She walked to the side, gently comforting him, and soon grabbed her bag, preparing to leave. Before heading out, she threw a parting shot. Gabriel, if you don't want me to get angry, don't ever mention divorce again. Otherwise, don't blame me for being ruthless when you regret it. She coldly dropped those words, slammed the door behind her, and left. I stood in the empty living room, staring at the door she had just slammed shut. A wave of mixed emotions washed over me, but mostly, there was a sense of relief. Grace, we have no future. I pushed down the last bit of attachment to this relationship. I placed the divorce agreement I had prepared earlier in the most obvious spot, grabbed my suitcase, and headed to the airport. On the other side, Grace made sure Jeremy was stable before leaving his house. As she walked down the street, she messaged Jeremy, discussing plans for tomorrow's dinner at her parents' house. But until she got in her car to head home, there was still no reply. She opened her phone to ask him again, but when she opened their conversation, she saw that the last message had been sent 3 days ago. Scrolling through, she saw a whole screen full of messages from Gabriel. Even though her replies were brief, he continued to share his daily updates. But in the past 3 days, Gabriel hadn't sent her a single message. Why such a drastic change? Grace hesitated for a moment before dialing Gabriel's number, but after a few rings, there was no answer. He had been fine just yesterday. Why couldn't she reach him today? Her heart suddenly began to race. Something didn't feel right. She tried to reassure herself while urging the driver to go faster. The repetition of dialing and hanging up didn't stop. By the time she got home, it was already dawn. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet. Gabriel, Grace called out, her heart tightening, an unexplainable anxiety building up. She called his name several more times, but there was no response. It was clear Gabriel wasn't home. What scared Grace even more was that everything belonging to Gabriel was gone. His clothes, his documents, even his toiletries. Everything was gone. Even the photo frame with their pictures was missing. Gabriel seemed like he had never existed. Grace stood trembling in the living room, her shoulders shaking. She had expected Gabriel to shout, to make a scene. She never imagined he would completely disappear from her life without a trace. Her eyes continued to search the room, unwilling to give up. Finally, her gaze landed on a set of documents on the table. It was a copy of Gabriel's identity deregistration document, along with a signed divorce agreement. With trembling hands, Grace picked up the papers, her eyes scanning the words in disbelief. Her heart sank, cold and heavy, into a bottomless pit. In her chaotic thoughts, the image of Gabriel's calm face when he said he wanted a divorce surfaced in her mind. He had known all along. When everything clicked into place, Grace, like a child, collapsed to the floor. Tears fell one by one, hitting the ground. In the following days, Grace began to frantically search for any trace of Gabriel, like a headless fly, but there was no sign of him. She even contacted all of Gabriel's friends, only to find that he had blocked and deleted everyone. Gabriel seemed to have vanished completely from her world, without a trace. In that moment, Grace finally realized she had lost someone in her life, someone she thought would always wait for her, someone who would forgive her no matter what mistakes she made. Chapter 4. The news of Gabriel's disappearance quickly reached Jeremy's ears. This time, he didn't hold back at all and went straight to find Grace without any hesitation. When he knocked on the door and saw Grace looking haggard and disheveled, a hint of disdain flashed in his eyes, but he still put on a compassionate expression and said, "Look at you. You've made yourself so worn out. It breaks my heart. I'm worried about Gabriel's sudden disappearance too, but you still need to take care of yourself. I brought you some food. You should eat a little. You've lost so much weight." Jeremy. Grace wanted to ask him why Gabriel might have left, but as soon as she opened her mouth, she was interrupted. "I know what you're going to say. Don't worry. No matter what, I'll always be by your side. I'll heat up the food. We'll talk later." With that, he turned and walked into the kitchen. Grace stood there, watching Jeremy's back, her heart filled with mixed emotions. At that moment, Jeremy's phone on the table suddenly rang with a message alert. Compelled by curiosity, she clicked on it. To her surprise, the conversation displayed was with Gabriel. Wasn't Jeremy and Gabriel always at odds? How could they possibly still be in contact privately? Intrigued, she clicked into the conversation. What she saw next were a series of provocative photos and comments sent by Jeremy. Grace's heart instantly froze. The taunting messages felt like icy needles piercing her bones. Now, she finally understood why Gabriel had insisted on divorcing her. Just then, Jeremy came back with the food. When he saw Grace holding his phone, his face immediately changed. The tenderness in his eyes was instantly replaced with anger. He rushed forward, snatched the phone back, and said, his voice laced with uncontrollable fury, "What are you doing? Who told you to look through my phone?" Grace stood frozen, her heart heavy with disbelief. She couldn't believe that this man in front of her would do such a thing. "Jeremy, haven't I been good enough to you? I gave you a job, money. I even bought you a house and a car. Why would you do something like this?" Grace's eyes were filled with disappointment and confusion, and her voice trembled as she questioned him. "Grace, you're mistaken. It's not what you think." Jeremy tried to explain, but his voice lacked the confidence he once had. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself. I did all this for you. For our future. For us." Grace's voice dripped with sarcasm and bitterness. "Your future involves getting rid of Gabriel and taking his place. Didn't I tell you not to have such thoughts? My husband is only Gabriel. It's you. It's you who drove him away." Grace's gaze grew sharp, colder than ice. Hearing this, Jeremy stopped pretending. His face contorted with malice as he said, "What does it have to do with me? Grace, stop pretending to be so loving. On Gabriel's birthday, you left him alone at home and went out to be with another man. Not me. When he was sick and hospitalized, it wasn't me who abandoned him. When he was humiliated by your parents, it was you who stood by and watched coldly." Grace was stunned. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but in the end, she couldn't say a word. Elsewhere, in Africa, during the time when Grace was looking for me, I had fully immersed myself in my research work. In my past life, when I received the Research Institute's job offer, Grace had tried to convince me to give up the opportunity. "You just got married, and now you're leaving. What am I supposed to do alone? If you keep leaving like this, it'll be hard to see you even once. Why don't you stay, and we can be together, taking care of our home?" At that time, I thought Grace really couldn't bear to part with me, so I gave up on reporting to the Institute. But later, I found out the truth. Grace had tied me down with her body and the company, never allowing me to join the research team. All for Jeremy. Fortunately, this time, I finally had the chance to pursue my dreams. I stayed in Africa for 6 years. After 6 years, when the project made progress, we were finally able to board the return flight. But unexpectedly, Grace had somehow gotten hold of my flight information and directly ambushed me at the airport. She looked at me in disbelief, as if confirming that I was still alive. Her eyes filled with tears. I stared at her coldly, my heart unmoved. Years had passed. Grace was no longer the youthful beauty she once was. Fine lines had appeared around her eyes. Her face was pale, and she had become gaunt. These words described her perfectly. After confirming it was really me, Grace didn't hesitate to rush into my arms, sobbing, "Gabriel, you're back. You're finally back." I pushed her away from my embrace, stepping back a few steps. Grace seemed to be hit hard. She grabbed my arm, her voice choking with emotion. "Gabriel, it's me. Don't you remember? It's Grace. Do you know how hard I've searched for you all these years?" I spoke coldly, my voice firm. "We're divorced. Please have some dignity." Grace trembled, her lips quivering. "Gabriel, you're still angry with me, aren't you?" I know I was wrong. I apologize. Please don't leave me again. Hearing her late apology, I couldn't help but laugh. It sounded like the best joke I'd ever heard. Don't worry. I've never blamed you. I left you simply because I didn't love you anymore. So please don't disturb me again. She shook her red eyes. But I didn't sign the papers. The divorce doesn't count. Grace's eyes were filled with emotion, her pale lips trembling slightly. Gabriel, I was wrong. I really don't want the divorce. She clung too tightly, and it took all my strength to break free. I pushed her back, and she stumbled 2 steps and fell to the ground. I suggest you sign the divorce papers as soon as possible. If you continue to harass me, we'll have to meet in court. She stared at me with red eyes, tears falling as her voice became hoarse. Gabriel, is there really no chance for us to make up? We were together for 7 years. From dating to marriage, we've been through so much. Are you really giving up so easily? Her question was both unnecessary and laughable, because my love for her wasn't something that faded in an instant. It was worn away little by little with every betrayal. Yes, I've given up. Rather than saying I gave up, I'd say I no longer love you. From the moment I filed for divorce, I no longer loved you. Her face turned pale as I spoke. After a long silence, she looked at me almost pleadingly. But I really love you. I can't lose you. That's your problem, not mine. What you need to do now is agree to the divorce. Not expecting me to be so resolute, Grace turned as pale as a ghost. Her eyes filled with despair and helplessness. She seemed to want to say something, but in the end, she only let her hands drop helplessly, standing there, silently shedding tears. Then, with the assistance of other personnel, I resolutely turned and left. Chapter 5. I thought I had made myself clear enough to make her give up completely. However, the next day, instead of receiving the divorce papers, I was greeted with a breakfast she had made herself. What does this mean? I frowned, not understanding what she was trying to do. She lowered her head, her voice weak. Gabriel, you've always taken care of me. From now on, I'll take good care of you. When you see how good I am to you, maybe we can return to the way we were. I interrupted her directly. No, I already have a girlfriend. If you keep doing this, my girlfriend will get upset. You should let go of this idea. You've fallen for someone else. Grace's lips trembled, and her eyes widened in shock. Just as I was about to speak, a figure approached and greeted me. It was Sophia. She walked up with a smile, wearing a white dress that, combined with her delicate features, made her look exceptionally fresh and elegant, exuding an air of noble intelligence. Noticing Grace standing nearby, she looked at her in surprise. Gabriel, who is this? Sophia asked, coming closer and linking her arm with mine. Grace stared blankly at Sophia, and a sense of inferiority grew in her eyes. I responded indifferently, a friend from the past. Grace's lips twitched slightly, tears welling up in her eyes, but she fought them back. She didn't continue the conversation. Instead, she struggled to control her tears and managed to whisper a few words. I've lost you. Wish you happiness. Even though she tried hard to hold back, her tears still fell. It took a while for her to calm down. Wiping away the tears at the corner of her eyes, she forced a faint smile, as if trying to hide her sadness. I didn't know what she was feeling at that moment, but it surely didn't compare to the pain I felt in my past life. With that thought, I didn't look at her again and immediately pulled Sophia away. I thought this matter would finally come to an end, but that night, I received a call from Grace's mother. Seeing the caller ID showing ex-mother-in-law, my heart felt complicated. Whether in this life or the past, she had always been the one who opposed Grace and me being together the most. If it weren't for how deeply we loved each other at the time, she would never have let Grace marry me. Remembering the ridicule I had suffered from her before, I felt an unexplained sense of disgust and immediately hung up the phone. However, Grace's mother's calls kept coming, one after another. Unable to ignore her, I finally answered the call. As soon as I picked up, I heard Grace's mother's anxious voice. Gabriel, Grace is in trouble. Please come to the hospital. I immediately interrupted her coldly. What does it have to do with me if she's in trouble? I'm not a doctor. Also, we're divorced. Don't contact me about these things anymore. There was silence on the other end for a moment. Then her voice choked with emotion. Gabriel, I beg you, for old time's sake, please come. If you don't go see her, she might not make it. You can't just watch her die. Grace's mom sounded desperate. I took a deep breath, my mind in turmoil, and finally gave in. Tell me the hospital address. After hanging up, I drove there quickly, the speed of the car matching the heaviness in my heart. At the hospital, Grace's mother was standing by the bed, crying as soon as she saw me. When she saw me, hope flashed in her eyes, and she trembled as she spoke. Gabriel, you're finally here. Grace, she tried to commit suicide by cutting her wrist last night. She was barely saved yesterday and is still disoriented, not even recognizing me. She's been calling for you the whole time. I walked up to the bed. Grace's face was pale, her wrist wrapped in thick bandages. Her eyelids fluttered, as if sensing my presence. and she struggled to give a weak smile. Gabriel, her voice was faint, tears falling from the corners of her eyes. I'm sorry, I've made things difficult for you. I just wanted to see you one more time. Her hand weakly lifted, trying to touch my fingertip, but it fell back powerless. Gabriel, is there really no chance for us anymore? I didn't deny it, replying calmly, What's past is past. We can't go back. Grace let out a bitter laugh. It seemed she had already known the answer. Well, who would want someone who's hurt them? I deserve this. I brought this upon myself. Her lips trembled as if she wanted to say more but ultimately kept silent. She could only watch me leave with reddened eyes, silently shedding tears. Chapter 6. After that day, Grace never came to find me again. I heard that after staying in the hospital for a week, she was taken back home by her mother. A few days later, I received the divorce papers from her, sent by her lawyer. The papers didn't include the harsh terms of the prenuptial agreement, which had originally required me to leave empty-handed. Instead, all the assets under my name were split in half, and I was given my share. I signed the papers, but there wasn't a single feeling of relief in my heart. Perhaps true liberation doesn't come from signing a piece of paper, but from inner peace and acceptance. Time continued to pass, and 6 months went by. Sophia and I went through the stages of proposal, engagement, and finally, marriage. On the wedding day, the sky was clear and sunny. Sunlight streamed through the colorful glass of the church, casting beautiful patterns of light. Sophia, in her exquisite white wedding dress, slowly walked to my side. We exchanged rings. Amid the congratulations of friends and family, we kissed. After the reception started, Sophia and I took turns offering toasts. Halfway through, I bumped into someone. It had been 6 years, and he was a completely different person now. He looked haggard, unshaven, and his eyes were hollow. If it hadn't been for his sly eyes, I wouldn't have recognized him at first. But why was he here? As I pondered, Jeremy walked closer. Seeing his dark expression, an ominous premonition suddenly arose in my heart. Just as I was about to shout, he suddenly pulled a knife from his sleeve. It's all your fault. If it weren't for you, Grace wouldn't have left me. I wouldn't have fallen this low. You ruined me, and now I have nothing left. I'm going to kill you. He hissed through his teeth, glaring at me as if he wanted to tear me apart. You won't let me live in peace. Then you won't get to live either. His eyes were bloodshot, and he rushed towards me. I instinctively sidestepped, and the knife slashed through the air with a sharp screech. The surroundings instantly fell into chaos, with guests screaming and scattering. I quickly shielded Sophia, but to my surprise, the next moment, Jeremy lunged at me again with the knife. The distance was too close, and the speed too fast. I couldn't dodge in time. Just then, Grace, I don't know from where, suddenly appeared and threw herself in front of me, blocking the blade with her body. The knife sank deep into her abdomen. Blood instantly soaked her clothes, and Grace's face turned pale, but she clutched the knife in Jeremy's hand tightly. Jeremy froze in shock. His eyes gradually cleared, and the knife dropped from his hand. At that moment, security rushed forward and quickly subdued Jeremy. Just before Grace collapsed, I rushed over and caught her. Her breath was weak, but she forced a smile. I was just here to congratulate you on your wedding. I didn't expect this. Grace was breathing heavily. Despite the injury, there was a sense of relief in her. At least, I guess this is my gift to you, Gabriel. I've paid back what I owed you. Others might not understand what she was saying, but I did. She wanted to repay me for everything she had done to me with that knife. Her voice grew weaker, and I tightly gripped her hand, my heart full of mixed emotions. Soon, Jeremy was taken away by the police, and Grace was rushed to the ambulance. Fortunately, after emergency surgery, she survived. Jeremy, on the other hand, was sentenced to 30 years for attempted murder. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. The night I left Kyoto, I went to visit Grace in the hospital. She lay in the bed, still pale. When she saw me, a complicated emotion flashed in her eyes. I'm sorry. It's all because of me that I ruined your wedding. Her voice was weak, and tears hung at the corner of her eyes. The doctor said I damaged a nerve, and I'll probably spend the rest of my life in a hospital bed. I guess this is my punishment, Grace said, her tears welling up. This is your own fault, I replied coldly. Her tears immediately fell. I didn't know if she ever recovered, nor did I care, because after leaving the hospital, Sophia and I went abroad. A year later, Sophia gave birth to a beautiful daughter. The moment the baby was born, the hospital room was filled with joy and blessings. Looking at my daughter's tender face, I felt like this was the greatest gift I could have received after being reborn. I gently stroked Sophia's hand, feeling thankful that fate had given me the chance to protect the people I loved.